Welcome to Word of Their Testimony, where we tell stories of real faith and real life. Our guest today is Misty Nisley from Queens, New York. Queens, interesting fact, is one of the most linguistically diverse communities in all of the world, actually. Over 150 languages are spoken. Nearby where Misty lives with her husband, Josh, and Josh and Misty head up a church plant there in Queens. Misty, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So your story doesn't begin in Queens, though. It begins in West Virginia, right? Tell us how it starts.
Okay, well, my story begins at the age of 18 months. I was placed into foster care. I don't have just a lot of memories. Before foster care, I have a few, but not a lot. So, like I said, at 18 months, I was placed into a foster care. I was placed with a Mennonite family, and they already had adopted one child before I came into their home, and they also had multiple foster children before I came into their home at that time. I don't remember just a lot about being a foster child. I do know that I would need to go home for weekend visits, as is standard for a lot of cases, and I remember I hated those visits. And I had learned fairly quickly that if I would cry and scream and throw a fit, somebody would pick up the phone and call and say, "Please come get her, she doesn't like it," and the visit would be over. And then during that time, I was with my foster family for a number of weeks, and the social worker really pushed for me to be reunited with my birth mom. And so that was the plan. My foster parents were devastated by that because they knew I'd not be going back into a good situation. They had heard from people in the community that they would see my mom walking with me along the railroad tracks, and they just did not know what was happening. And I was back with my mom for just a few short weeks. And she called my foster mom and she said, "It's not working." She's like, "If you want her, you can come pick her up. You can have her." And she was willing to surrender her rights at that point and said, "I would love for you to adopt her."
And so how old were you then when you proceeded to adoption? Can you tell me about that day of adoption? Do you remember it?
I do. It was right before my 4th birthday. It was the end of February. And I remember going to the courthouse and sitting in a big chair and watching them sign the papers, and I knew that it was a really, really special day for them.
Would you say your adopted parents did right in that whole process? It seems like there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of uncertainty, but you mentioned in our prep that you felt like they really handled it well. Can you tell me about that?
I feel like they did really, really well at talking very openly about adoption and how I became part of their family. It was never one of these things where I always wondered, how did I end up here? Like, I always knew from little up that I was wanted, and I was really chosen by them. And one story that really is precious to me since my adoptive dad has passed away now is how the first time he met me, he said I was sitting in the high chair and I was eating lunch, and he came home and sat down and had lunch. And he said he looked at me and he said hi, and he said I smiled at him. And he had told my mom just the day or two before, he's like, "I think our family is the perfect size at 5 children. And he said after he saw me, he's like, "No, if she comes up for adoption, we want her to." And so that's really special to me because I feel like I was definitely chosen and I was wanted by them. And the other thing I think they also did really, really well at is telling me that any time that I want to meet my birth mother, they will be happy to go with me. She actually lives in the small town that I grew up in. So they knew who she was, and so it was never like, you may not have any contact with her. They were willing to facilitate that contact.
And life wasn't all great, though, even though you had a really great beginning to your adoption. Can you tell me a little bit more about growing up, specifically as one of the few people of color in your family and community?
Sure. Most of the time, I did not really think about being different than the other kids growing up. There were comments that were made. I was called the N-word one time at the Christian school that I attended. My dad also traveled a lot because he was a pastor, so we'd go to many, many different churches. And I remember little girls would come up to me after church and they would look at you, or they would look at me, then they would laugh and they would run away. And I always felt like, well, I just wanted somebody to play with. Or another one would be people like, oh, I love your hair. May I touch your hair? And I was always like, no, please don't. And so some of those things when I was little that were difficult things. And then as I got older, I was attending a Mennonite Bible school, and a comment was made, well, I have no idea who you would ever marry due to your skin color. And so those were some difficult things to wrestle through.
Interesting. And did you ever see your birth mom then? When did you meet her?
Yes, I did. I met her right around the age of 16. And it was one of those things that I always wanted to be able to meet her, but I was never quite wanting to take that step. And I have a brother, and our great aunt raised him. And so when her husband passed away, I went to take food and to express my condolences, and a lady opened the door and called me by name, which was not unusual in our community. And so I continued talking with my aunt and some of the other family that was there. And then when we left, my adoptive mom said to me, she's like, do you know who opened the door? And I said, I have no clue. And she said, well, that was your birth mom. And I said some things about her that were not pleasant, that were not acceptable to say. But I was so taken back and so shocked. But at the same time, it was really good for me. Because, I've always wondered, like, well, who did I look like? Because we don't know who my biological dad is. But I took one look at my mom, I was like, I look just like her. And so that was sort of a healing thing in a way. Because at 16, life is already rough and you wrestle through many, many things. And after she realized that I knew who she was, she came to my workplace one day and she just talked and talked and talked. And it felt like she was sort of catching up for all those years that she had missed out on.
And you mentioned your birth brother. Can you tell me more about his story?
I really don't know a lot about his story. As far as I know, we do not share the same father. We share the same mother. And when I was placed into foster care, he also was placed with our great aunt. And so she raised him. He was never adopted by her, but she raised him. And she made sure that we always could stay in contact with each other, for birthdays or for in the summer when we both were out of school, we'd get together and have pizza together and those sorts of things. And like a special memory is like he came to my wedding. Like that was one thing he was not going to miss. And so today we still have contact via Facebook.
Nice. So sounds like you had a fairly good experience with foster care and adoption. And but in spite of that, after you married Josh, you said you really never wanted to consider being a foster parent yourself or adopting. Tell me what happened next.
Yes, I always said I would never be a foster parent. It was something I was never going to do. And part of it was because I watched my parents care for other foster children after I came along and how they would get so attached. And then the whole giving up the child back to either a parent or adoption, and sometimes not knowing what kind of situation it was going to be. And I was like, adoption is not for me. I don't want to adopt. I don't want to foster. I'm happy to adopt, but foster, no, I did not want to ever foster.
And what if some of our listeners are considering foster care? What advice would you have, or foster care or adoption? What would you say that you would want them to know if they should decide?
Number one, it's not going to be easy. And also don't think about it as going in to rescue a child. Because children in foster care did not make the decisions that caused them to end up in care. It was not their fault. And also remember that the birth family is not your enemy. So often we can look negatively at the birth family, but 9 times out of 10, they were just sort of dealt a rotten hand. And just go into it being a learner. You may have the right answers, but sometimes you just need to be a learner. And the other thing I would say to somebody who's considering a foster care or adoption is have a support team. Have a group of people around you, especially those who have walked that journey. they can speak into your life in ways that a lot of other people cannot.
Very interesting. And God has, must have a sense of humor, because in spite of your aversion to foster care or adoption, things changed, and God brought you down a different path. Tell me about that.
So, Josh and I got married in 2007, and we struggled with infertility for a few years. And we wanted a family, so we thought, well, we will do adoption. Because I had always wanted to adopt, because it sort of felt like a way that I could give back the gift that was given to me. So we filled out all the adoption paperwork, that huge stack that comes, and you got your home certified and all of those things. And then I found out I was pregnant, and we were overjoyed. And then around 17 weeks, my water broke, and I ended up on bed rest for 3 weeks. And during that time, I remember we just prayed and we cried out to God, asking to let our little baby live. But God had other plans. And on May the 9th, 2011, I gave birth to a little girl who lived for just a few short moments. And that was a really hard and dark time for me, because it felt like God didn't care, and that he didn't care about our desire to have children, and that it wasn't important to him. And then soon after that, we moved. We had lived in Kansas at that time. We moved to New York City. And never once did foster care ever enter my mind. I was like, nope, we're not doing that. And we talked about wanting to adopt, but never felt like the time was right, or, it's a huge financial undertaking, and some of those things. And God did a work in our heart. And it was towards the end of 2018 that we, maybe we should consider foster care. Maybe this is what God is calling us to. And one of the verses that sort of pushed us in that direction is there in James, where it talks about caring for the widow and the orphan. And it felt like, well, this was one thing we could do. And so in December of 2018, we are sitting in an information meeting about foster care, and by May of 2019, we were licensed foster parents here in New York City. And it was about a week after our home was open, we got a call to take a 4-month baby boy. And Noah has been in our home ever since, and we are in the process of adopting him.
That's beautiful. It seems like one of the challenges with foster care, and you alluded to it earlier, that to be a foster parent, you have to be okay with loss, and you have to be okay with the child leaving, as your parents were when you went back to your birth mom there for a little bit. How have you handled that feeling of loss, or that potential loss, as you've gone through this process with Noah?
It is one of those things you sort of have to hold with open hands. I feel like to a certain extent we have not got an accurate picture of foster care, because our first placement is now working out that we're able to adopt him. But early on, when we first had him, there was a time when they said, oh, there's a family member that might want him. And I remember how we cried. We're like, no, we've only had him for 3 months, but we can't give him up. And so I feel like it's one of those tensions you have to hold with open hands. We also were able to have Noah's half-sister with us for just a few short weeks. And she left suddenly, and we were not able to say goodbye. And that was hard, because it's like, well, we'll probably never see her again, but I have to remind myself that we loved her the best that we knew how when we had her, and God can take care of the rest. And so, yeah, it's just one of those things, it's a tension that you just sort of have to hold with open hands.
And it seems like when you really love, and you really want to love the way Jesus did, you don't have any guarantees, right? It's beautiful. What about those that maybe can't foster care for whatever reason? Is there things our listeners can do to sort of help other people foster care?
Yes, there are things that they can do. Number one, pray. And mentor children that are, in the foster care system. Advocate for children. Pay for a weekend away for a foster parent. Or you can become certified babysitters. Those are always very, very helpful things. Or even if someone has just received a new placement, taking meals to them, because it can be a hectic time when you get a new placement because there's doctor visits and there's all these things. And so there are things that they can do, but just even asking, like, how's it going, and just being a caring person is really, really important.
There's a plethora of ways. I didn't realize there was a certified babysitter you can become. That's interesting. So I assume you have to go through some kind of process where they vet and make sure your home is safe and whatnot, and then you can become like an official babysitter for the foster child. Is that the way that works?
Yes. Now, for here in New York, at least for us, they just do a background check on the person. And then we had to take a parenting class, and then basically if we feel safe leaving our biological child with that person, then we're allowed to leave our foster child there. But still, not everybody's willing to do the whole background check type of thing.
Excellent. So let's talk specifically about cross-racial adoption. What would you like to share with our listeners regarding the dynamics of foster or adoption when the child is a different race than the parents?
I would say embrace the culture that the child comes from. There are good things and bad things about each culture, but find the good things from the culture that the child comes from and try to embrace those. If the child is, 5, 6, 7, and they speak a different language, like, try to learn some words in that language. If their hair is different than yours, learn hair care. Just some of those things. Foods are also another big thing.
Beautiful. What would you say has been the hardest part of this journey for you?
I think some of it has just been the unknowns, not knowing what's the next turn going to look like, and also sort of feeling our agency is a little incompetent at times, and that skill is lacking, and just being okay with things not moving along as quickly as we would like to see them. And then also too, just the whole thing of, loving a child and then saying goodbye. That was hard with Noah's half sister. And then just, the whole, you have an agency that sort of dictates what you can and cannot do, and just learning to be okay with that, and, doing things their way even though it would not be my first preference at times.
Interesting. So you put your heart out there loving this child, but you've got the agency telling you what to do, you've got the birth parents potentially telling you what to do, or you're managing that relationship, plus you're figuring out how to be a parent yourself for the first time in your case. Seems like a lot. Would you trade it for anything?
Not a single thing in the world. We love Noah dearly, and it has been a hard journey, but it has been a really, really beautiful journey, and I would not trade it for anything.
For over a year, I've been sort of harassing you to tell your story, and my sense is that it's not easy to tell your story. Can you tell me a little bit about that, if you want?
I think part of it is it feels like there's sort of a stigma that adopted children don't turn out right, or, oh, you were adopted, so therefore you must have this whole list of issues. And I have heard those comments made to people. I have felt those comments. And that's hard. And so for me, it's like, I don't really want to tell my story because, like, oh, well, but you had it so good. And I do feel like I had it really, really well, because I know of children that have been adopted that have not had the same experience that I have. But I also want people to know that it can be a beautiful thing, and not to just say, oh, they're in foster care, they're adopted, therefore they're probably going to not turn out that great, but to give them a chance.
Well, thank you for being brave and bringing your story to our listeners. I think it's really powerful. It's gotten me excited just hearing you talk today about what God can do when He brings together parents that are committed to Him, that want to be biblical and follow the basic commands of Scripture, and as the church comes around them in the ways you described, it can be a beautiful experience. So thank you so much for giving me kind of an optimistic and exciting picture of that. And I think there is this stigma, right? Like you said, I think we've heard stories, adoptees that have broken their parents' heart, and even if that should happen, or if there's pain involved, God still calls us to do this, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't say if it works out, you obey me. So thank you for sharing that and hopefully giving our listeners some courage and some optimism about what could be done in their communities. I want to leave you just with one final chance to share anything you'd like to with our listeners.
Foster care and adoption are a holy calling, and it's gospel work. And God will give you the strength and the grace for the journey if that is what He has called you to do.
It's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you to our listeners for listening. Stay tuned. We'll have a few more podcasts coming shortly as we really dig deeper into living out faith in real ways in real life.